And it's time for another show, Tim. How are you?
I'm doing well. What's your week like, Merv? Are you settling into a nice weekend?
Not really. I mean, it's going to be a nice weekend, but it's going to be one of things that I have to get done for myself, not for my clients. So in many ways, it's a lot of work, but in many ways, it's good work because it's for me.
That's great. That's great. So your clients right now are working remotely, right?
They are, yes.
Okay.
Well, yes. Pretty preponderance of the work is done remotely. On occasion, people do come into the office. Now, my clients are in another state, so I do not benefit from coming into the office with them, but occasionally they do.
Good. So today's conversation is going to be rather interesting because I wanted to explore both what the benefits and hazards of managing projects remotely, as well as managing workers remotely as well. And I know both you and I have experience in this. So let's kick it off. Let me give you my experience, though. It's rather interesting. In the early 2000s, I was flown by a major corporation all over the country, right? I'd go sit down with my clients. I'd usually send out an interview questionnaire to get the early questions out of the way so we could really dig into the meat. But as time progressed, especially about 2004, it seems that everybody hit a switch. And all of a sudden, they didn't have time for me on site. And they asked me, and about 2/3 by 2004, my clients were asking me, what are we going to do? I can't really have you interrupting our work. Can we actually do this remotely? And of course, being a consultant, I was saying, yes, you take stakeholders' consideration into account, but it wasn't just that. I was managing projects for governments across the planet. And the government that I was working in Asia wanted engineers from Germany, wanted a technical architect from Austin, and they wanted me as project manager. So obviously we had to do this. And then by 2004, it even got weirder. About that time, I said, let me try out this project management teaching stuff. And I looked at the opportunities to do it locally. And it's turned out the best thing that I could do was remote teaching in 2004. And I had about 50 people in my classes on a regular basis, which scared me.
Were they local classes or were these international classes?
These were international classes. I thought the PMP at the time. My PMP, by the way, is 5 digits. Okay, so I'm very early in the cycle. You start hitting 5 digits back in the mid 1990s, and I got mine in 2003. So I was in the high 5 digits, but it was very strange because I thought the PMP was a little known credential at that time, and 50 people per class. It was like, how am I going to manage people remotely? And that was frightening experience.
Well, and I can imagine that the tools, I mean, I know what my tools, the ones that I got to use back in 2000, I think back then I was still working for a corporation, and the tools were not that advanced. I mean, outside of this big fat, I forget what they called it, was a telestar or something, kind of a satellite that sat in the middle of a conference room table. And then if you were talking to people in another city, they had the equivalent in the middle of their table, and you would talk back and forth. And every once in a while, somebody would say, oh, we've just dropped the connection. I mean, it was kind of a convoluted effect, and you couldn't see who was talking, and people would talk over each other and interrupt each other and on and on and on. So I can't imagine, even from a teaching perspective, that doing it remotely was much fun.
It was difficult. It had to be a lecture series, not an engaging interaction. And my company, luckily, had deep relationships with the early tech developers in this area. But at the same point, like you said, we had to accommodate for the tools a lot. But I tell you, as we grew, the demand for what the tools could do grew too. It was just like, you stand right now, you stand in front of your microwave and you say, hurry up, right? It was the same thing with the tools back then. It was like, it was a miracle back in 2004, but by 2007, we were, living the limitations daily.
Well, and I can think back to when I remember when you could add other people onto your telephone calls. So you were speaking desk phone to desk phone with someone in another city, and you could say, wait a minute, let me get Betty on the thing. And you would hit some button and you would dial Betty's number and she would come on, and you'd hit another button. And now three of you were talking. And I remember those days, and that you could have a conference call. And I think some of those kinds of innovations early on made us kind of marvel at what the possibilities are. And think about today alone, I have been on Zoom, I have been on WebEx, and I have been on Teams, all three in one day. And you have to be able to have the facility, the skill, whatever, to be able to switch back and forth between the three mediums or more if there are others. But what I like about this whole remote process, even though I miss office interaction, is I have been able to, in very many cases, handle a client situation if they think I'm in the next office.
Isn't that crazy?
As opposed to 1,600 miles away. Absolutely.
And this is one of the things that I write in my journal a lot. Is it the tools are getting so ubiquitous, or is our definition of the office changing? Is office going beyond the limitations of the facility?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think as long as, I mean, for some people perhaps who are not using the tools every day and all day like we tend to do. But I think typically, well, maybe tools leapfrog and then we leapfrog the tools and then the tools leapfrog again. It's just one of those things where someone sees a need and invents something. You see the need for it. I mean, who knew that video conferencing would become such an incredible tool? I mean, the fact that I don't have to pay $600 a week for a plane ticket, well, because I can get on a Zoom call, saves my bottom line immense amounts of dollars, plus the hotel room and all that.
Well, and think about what you were talking about earlier, the ability to bring people onto calls. I remember back in 1997, being able to establish hardwired connections between cities so that we could actually call another state as if it were a local number, and then use the telephonic system to actually conference inside the company. And now we just, we have WhatsApp that's more powerful than any PBX system we ever had back then.
Well, and I think, these tools become such incredible pieces of what we kind of take for granted. I mean, who knew years ago when Word came into being? I was at some point when I became good enough with Word, I was able to run a project without an administrative assistant because I did a lot of that myself. But as we do this, as we think about these tools, let's get into perhaps thinking about our teams, the human aspects, the people aspects of what it is that we do in terms of managing. Now we're starting to come back in the office. We're allowing people to be remote as well. But even a few months ago, it was mostly remote, very, very little office work. And so I'm trying to think, what do you think, like even from your own experience, would you rather work remotely? Is it easier to work remotely as an individual, or do you think it's easier for you to manage remotely?
Oh, hands down, do the work. Hands down, do the work. Because number one, I have control over that. I don't have to influence myself so much. Number two, I can apply a certain amount of discipline with confidence to understand exactly where the work is. When you're managing people, you have to build that framework and infrastructure and the relationship and the collaborative environment so that you get that information flow and you understand it. But if I'm just doing the work, I'm doing the work, and and I've been working remotely since, like I said, about 2004, 2005. And I don't know any other type of work besides, my bunches of files and bunches of papers and my prioritization.
I think for me also, but that maybe that's a part of our personality in terms of the fact that both you and I I know are self-starters. I know we prefer less interruption. Well, most people prefer less interruption in order to be able to focus on the task and get things done. I find that remote working, when I'm given a task, I can typically complete it in 1/10 of the time that I could in, say, a busy office in many ways. So yes, from a working perspective, for me personally, probably for you as well, being logical IT people, I think it's great to be able to work remotely and therefore work in a way that is much more focused. But there is that managing aspect.
Yes, yes. As a creative, I agree with you. I need those uninterrupted blocks of time where I can dig deep into a thought and just stay with it for hours and hours. You can't get that in an office. But you're right. Managing people is both a skill and an art, and that's face to face. And when you're starting to extend them over, it gets tricky. It gets really tricky.
Well, and I mentioned that probably from both you and ourselves being more self-starters, more capable of kind of making sure things are happening as we work. But there are those people who thrive in a kind of a hubbub, a beehive of activity. I know a project I did a few years ago. I was in an open office concept. We didn't even have cubicles.
Mm-hmm.
And I could, people would be able to work and they'd be able to kind of shout across the transom to their next person or say something and then get back to work. People could thrive at that. I could not thrive in that, but some people did. And I think those people now who are thrust at home, alone, quiet, maybe they turn on a podcast or music or whatever it is, but I think those people have more difficulty in organizing themselves around work in a remote environment.
Yeah, and it's not just the noise, it's not just the hubbub, it's the engagement with other people that you have inside the office. That's one of the things that I noticed in my transition, was that all of a sudden I couldn't just connect with people like me, my trusted advisors and tribes. I couldn't just say, can you go down to the cafeteria and grab a cup of coffee? Now, since then, I've learned how to do it remotely, but at the same point, it's a little different when you do this. And as a manager, your management has to do, 90% of it's sharing information with people. And so it gets really tricky.
Well, it does. And just yesterday, in fact, as you know, I'm working in an advisory capacity to a very large project in another state. I came out of retirement to kind of help them for a little while, and then and then I'll go back to my blissful, peaceful retirement, writing blogs and doing more short-term advice. But in this situation, one of their project managers called me up and said, "Hey, I would like you to mentor me." Now, he's several hundred miles from where I am. And what I responded to him is I said, you and I have such little interaction being in some of these meetings. I will watch out for the things that you want to be mentored in. But where I am really handicapped is I'm not there. I'm not dropping into your office. I'm not bumping into you in the hallway. I'm not grabbing you for coffee in the cafeteria. And so part of what's going to be lacking in my ability to mentor you is the fact that I'm physically not around you, watching you when you don't know I'm watching you. So we still have some challenges with being able to manage or mentor or whatever it is from a remote perspective.
You know what? Let's come back to that.
Yeah.
Let's come back to that. That's an interesting thing, and there's some threads there I think we can pull on. But first, You're talking about working remotely, and we're talking about managing remote workers. What does a day in a project manager's work week look like as they're managing remotely?
For me, there's a lot of check-ins. So face to face, some of them are 15 minutes long. Typically, we do a stand up in the morning for 15 minutes where the whole group checks in. What are you going to do today? At the end of the day, we check in again and say, did you accomplish what you said you're going to do today? And are there any blockers or impediments or anything that we need to be able to get out of your way so you can do your work? So a day in the life of remoteness, I think, is that constant check-in. And oh, by the way, don't wait for the morning check-in or the late afternoon check-in. If there's something that's blocking you, call me right now. Don't wait. So I think it's just that constant communication, getting this Zoom process or WebEx process or whatever it is, get that moving, get that going, and make sure that we understand what's happening so that nothing blocks your progress.
Yeah. Even as a teacher and trainer online, I have a group. I'm one of 11 trainers in project management inside of a major corporation. And we have a set of about 20 to 25 technical assistants. And so we're interacting on a regular basis. So before the class and even sometimes during the class, we're interacting WhatsApp. What's going on? What do we need? Tim, I heard this student saying something directly to me. They have a technical issue, and it's really bizarre. It's not what I ever expected. And then from a strategic planning, I'm working with the directors and the managers of various organizations, partly advisement and partly working on collaborative activities, mini projects. And so they're spread all across the planet. And one of the difficult things I have is to actually synchronize my working day with the working day of the people that I'm supporting and engaging with, the students, the people that I'm working with, my peers, and also the decision makers, the executives. So a lot of it's that synchronizing and us having a good view of the calendar and also a good view of the work and, like you said, the progress.
Yeah, and similar to what I'm, one of the projects I'm advising right now, they have a team in India. So they're doing this: when America sleeps, India works. When India sleeps, America works. So they've kind of almost got a 24/5 operation in terms of getting the work done in their sprints. Now, part of what I, as an advisor and some of the management or some of the leadership, we didn't have visibility into that process. Now, we could go into the collaborative tool that they set up and look at the Kanban charts or look at that sort of thing and see the burn down and see what's happening. But one of the things that we did was we asked them, the developer, to once a week have a scrum of scrums that invites all of us, including leadership, and have them walk us through the process and have them tell us directly if there's any blockers or impediments. And it's amazing how much better that is, even once a week, than not having the visibility until the demo hits you after the sprint is completed and you find out that there's issues at that point. So there's, that constant check-in, that ability to work remotely, but yet keep the closeness is so important.
I've actually talked to many people like about 50 people who've gone through the agile transition inside their corporation. And they said this was the major hindrance to adopting agile. They love pieces of agile, but agile itself, like what you're doing, it sounds very agile, is difficult because it takes such a commitment, investment that people are not ready for. Traditional projects are like, go do the work, and when you're done, bring it back and I'll sign off on it. No, that's not the way this work works.
But I think it's, we started off with the remote tools and the remoteness and all that. I think it has brought a discipline to the process that we didn't even have when we were face to face. As much as we love face to face, I don't know, I think there is some benefit to the remoteness. Although I will say this, and go ahead, you were going to say something.
No, go ahead.
I will say this, there are still things that I worry about in the remote process. And I don't know about you. What do you think? Do you worry about certain aspects of it?
Oh yeah. This is something that I talk to my students about all the time. Number one, the needs of people do not change. People need somebody basically who has their back. They need somebody who's looking out for them so that their work doesn't stop and they have everything they need every step of the way. And that's why project managers there, right? Now, the problem is when you move from an office environment to a remote environment, all of a sudden you have something in the middle of you. You have tools. And like we said at the beginning, these tools have gaps in their capability, like Zoom right now. Both you and I can only see from the shoulders up. And although we're both pretty good at reading body language, that limits it to about 20 to 25% of the body. And then on top of that, how do we actually talk and have a conversation in this way without interrupting each other? There's a lot to be said. And actually, this is expressed really well in the training literature, project management. Communication, is sharing information two ways, intentionally and unintentionally. One of the things that I've learned, Merv, is that I've had to actually go back to the drawing board and remember that communication is not just what's being said, but what's not being said. And you're right. I've had to actually be much more astute in my active listening than I ever have been in a room.
Well, and for me, I also worry about very similar things. I particularly worry about those people who are gregarious and outgoing and very extroverted. Not that introverted, less gregarious people don't need social interaction, but I do worry about people who are basically feeling isolated in their rooms. And I'm wondering about their mental health, their emotional health, and just being able to check in on them often enough, even if it's just to grab a few minutes on the phone and joke around or something, just to keep their spirits up, just to know that someone's thinking about them. Let them share something. Their dog died. Let them share that. Let's talk about it. Yesterday, I talked to a young man who had 4 wisdom teeth pulled. So we talked about that for a few minutes, but just something, because we take it for granted in an office environment where you bump into each other and those conversations naturally happen. Now we have to kind of put it mentally in our minds to truly reach out and do those things.
It's a conscious action. Yeah.
Yes.
And you're right. It's that recognition and engagement that we can actually allow to slip unintentionally if we're not careful.
Yeah. I'm enjoying my 6-foot commute as opposed to what used to be 1,600 miles one way. But at the same time, I do miss those people who I love to be around on a daily basis.
Well, and what can beat an after dinner dessert for brainstorming and coming up with new ideas, a little dessert and coffee somehow shared with people stimulates the brain in ways that, sitting down over a cup of coffee with you remotely just will never happen.
I remember once, and this is going to sound kind of weird, but I remember I used to go out for dinner maybe once a quarter, once every 6 months or so with a very senior individual from one of the client firms that I was servicing. Now he was a very well-off individual. Clearly, he had a partnership in the business. But one thing I enjoyed was we would go out for a nice meal and he would buy a fairly extravagant bottle of wine, certainly something that did not come out of my budget, but just something like that. It was just a nice way to end the day, try something that I could not do on my own, and then just enjoy the conversation. And when we're remote, we miss that. We need to figure out ways to make the opportunities so that as we manage our virtual teams, we can bring those sorts of experiences still into our lives.
You know, you're right. You're right. Because we have the collaboration tools, we have the communication tools, we have the calendar tools, we have the scheduling tools, but we don't have those celebration tools yet.
Yeah. I cannot reach out and shake your hand. So right, I can make eye contact with you, but I can't reach out and shake your hand. And that part, their human touch is so important. And so how do we compensate for that as we lead virtual teams? The tools are helpful, but my goodness, we need to figure out something to help our virtual teams continue on in a healthy way.
You know, you're right. You're right. There has to be that human factor in it, and we're having to work on it now. So we know that remote working was necessary the last 2 years, right? We had to, that or company were going to fail. What makes remote working itself so pleasurable, not just for you, but for businesses? Let's take it up a notch. Why would a company want to adopt this?
Well, I tell you from experience, from talking to people, some of my clients, they've been able to release brick and mortar because they don't have as many people. Now that hurts the landlords, but especially from an IT company that has a headquarters or perhaps has satellite offices, they can release that and have their employees work from their homes. One of the companies that I work with, for every person that comes on board, they send them a desk and a laptop and the required tools to be able to work remotely. That sounds expensive, but compare that to the monthly rent or lease on office space downtown. That's a whole lot different. So I think that's one benefit.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Number two, if you distribute the work, you distribute your potential employment pool, of course.
Yes.
You know, and you have more competitive salaries. I expect to see lots of research on, you know, the impact of globalization of resource pools for major corporations, and see how that's going to impact the average salary of workers. We've known and we've seen this impact in the tech sector. Think about other areas that, you know, I'm not talking about the labs or other positions that require people to interact, but like the knowledge workers and the information workers like us, you know, I can see the salaries are going to be impacted.
Well, and my daughter lives in the East Bay of California, around San Francisco, south of San Francisco, and there's a huge, obviously we all know there's a huge tech center there. When this hit, a lot of employees who were coming into the office in those tech centers decided to move out of the East Bay across into where the housing was less expensive and they could buy their first homes. And so now they didn't have to commute across the bay or into the office. They could do everything from their home. They could, for the first time, afford homes. But what apparently anecdotally is happening is now those companies are looking at their salary structure and deciding that because they don't live in the high-priced area anymore, maybe they could cut their salaries because they live in a less expensive area. So, you know, I mean, sometimes there's incentives and sometimes you just feel disincented.
Yeah. And again, from a management perspective, if you're managing workers like a project manager, these are the things that I worry about. Like you said, you know, what's the mindset? What's the emotional health of my team? There's three indicators that I can use, whether I'm working in the office or whether I'm working remotely, that I can use to check in on my project. You know, the progress of the work, the cohesion of the team, and the participation of the individuals in the team. Those are my 3 KPIs that I use primarily to manage my remote work health. and again, the the leading indicator is the work slowing down, right? Now, the thing is, this takes a lot of time.
It does. And I just heard yesterday on a podcast. I wish I had written down the name of the podcast, but the gentleman who was speaking was saying, people are having trouble acquiring workers now, bringing them back to work. And in fact, many workers are leaving the workforce to do something else. And he said, people are giving all kinds of reasons for this. But as he questions them, what he's also finding out is that they're looking for a different purpose. They've come out of this whole situation where they used to go into work, go back, commute in, come back to, they're too tired to do anything in the evening, whatever it was. Now they had some respite from that, still working, but remotely. Now they're being asked to come back in the office and they're going, I'm going to find something different that uses what I believe my new purpose in life is, as opposed to just this requirement to go back and forth into work. So it's an interesting phenomenon that this whole remote work has caused people, even in their own minds or psyches, to even question the careers they've chosen.
This is really interesting because Herbert Maslow would call what you're talking about self-actualization. And in the middle of the 20th century, when he was putting together his hierarchy, he was assuming that only 1% of the people in the United States were going to find or even need to discover their purpose. And now, look at this. Look at how influential that is, that drive. Simon Sinek made a career out of this. And then you have Ryan Holiday and you have Tim Ferriss and you have all these guys. But I could name 12 people who are influencers who are making a lot of money on helping companies and football teams and military groups find their purpose and then work with that and use that for the motivation and fulfillment of their workers.
And here are you and I talking about leading virtual teams in the IT sector as project managers. I think what we have to do as project managers is to rethink this, because if we can't attract workers, or if our workers are finding different purposes because they're finding their work with us, although financially rewarding, not psychologically or purposefully rewarding, we need to somehow change that paradigm. Well, I hate that word, but I'm going to use it. Change that paradigm so that people want to feel like they're serving a purpose as they put in their work with us. So I think it's a bigger challenge now for us as project managers and as executives.
Well, it's global.
Yeah,
it's global because we were hit with so many crises. This was a perfect storm over the last 5 years. And we're not through with that storm yet if early experts are accurate. And they've been accurate to a great extent. So, we're going to have to think about this. So like it or not, we have the tools we have, and we're going to have to work with them smarter or better. Now, this gets me to a really good question. Let's swing it back to tools, and let's start talking about tools. We all have our favorite tools, right? And they work real well for us. But what makes a good remote working tool a great tool?
Oh, for me, the tools I choose, first of all, have to be easy to use. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be simple. They can be complex. It's just that they have to be intuitive and fairly easy to use. I mean, but the fact that I can switch between Zoom and WebEx and Teams from my earlier example with fair amount of ease says to me that they have put their buttons and their menus in places that make sense to me, so that even as it's not like going from a Chevrolet to a Mercedes to a Ferrari. It's a way of having to do what I have to do, and so that it's consistent and yet obvious. None of these tools are simple, but all of them are fairly intuitive. And that's, to me, that's my number one, ease
Right.
of use.
Right. It doesn't get in the way of the work. It enhances getting the work done. You don't have to think the tool. All you have to do is think the work. There was a guy by the name of Norman, and you can find him in design theory. And it's not just software design, it's systems design theory. And he created a movement early on, and he's written multiple editions of many of his books. And he coined the term human-centered design. How do I design something so it makes it real easy to get good work done, and it makes it real difficult to run into obstacles? And a guy by the name of Jim Clear actually took this to the next level. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Atomic Habits, where he said, this is great for software development, but you can use it in your own human behavior. And as a project manager, you can use this concept of human-centered design to build into the work, whether people are working remotely or face-to-face. How can we get the work done? How do we make it so the ball rolls down the hill into easy, good working? That means progress, and away from the chasm. That means we're going to hit something that's going to be work stoppage.
Well, and human-centered design is becoming more prevalent as well. As I mentioned before, one of the contracts that I'm providing advisory services to, they built into their proposal a whole kind of, I would say, a track within their process called human-centered design. And that has gone on parallel with our discovery sessions as we built user stories. And now that we're in our sprints, the human-centered design is sort of taking the lead, because the user stories, as they're being developed, need to fall along with what the human-centered design people found in their focus groups and their interviews with end users, and the ideas that they brought out from those who will eventually be doing the work. So I found it fascinating just in terms of how the teams kind of separated, and now they're coming back together to make sure that the product that is left behind is easily used by end users.
This is smart. These are the people who actually keep businesses in business. Now, let me step it up and go to a higher altitude and demonstrate how impactful this is. There was a business theory in the 1980s that said, if we want to make money, we want to actually listen to the investors. It's basically shareholder supremacy, right? The rule of shareholder supremacy. And it was a great model. It makes money real quickly, because what we're doing is we're raising the revenue to profit, more profit than revenue. We're also raising earnings per share, which means you have more investors, you have more profit, you have more room for growth. Great, until the late 1990s. Where we realized that we were ignoring, and this wasn't just one corporation, this was corporate culture that was realizing, wait, the workers are the one who work directly with the people who are buying the products. We're not listening to the workers. We're not listening to people buying the products. We're missing this whole boat. And so this human-centered design is becoming much more important. This is not just big, this is big. This is a cultural evolution. I mean, revolution, not just an evolution.
Well, and I suspect you just reminded me of something that happened it's been a while, and some of the people listening to us today may be old enough to remember this. But there was a time when Detroit was the king of the auto world, and they allowed their quality to slip because of exactly what you were saying. It was good for the shareholders to have perhaps less quality that the public would deal with or put up with, but it would turn a few extra dollars per car into the hands of the shareholders. And then what happened was they began to lose their share of the market, and they couldn't figure out what was happening until they called from Detroit to a large dealership somewhere in LA who said, you guys got to get out here. Like the freeways are crawling with smaller cars from Japan. And these cars from Japan were much higher in quality. They were tighter. They rode on the road with less road noise. I mean, they were much improved engineering design. And suddenly Detroit was caught flat-footed because of this revolution that had come through. Someone recognized the end user wanted a better product, and they provided it to them. So I think that's it's not an IT example, but it certainly talks about what you were just talking about in terms of human-centered design. Yeah,
exactly. And Peter Drucker and W.E. Deming hit it right on the head in the 70s and 80s. And W.E. Deming, in his book Out of the Crisis, you can tell, one of the quality gurus of the 20th century, saying this is a crisis. Yeah. He wrote these 14 points, and these 14 points would be the same points you and I would talk about right now that are critical for businesses to stay in business, and for managers to actually retain workers, much less help them produce more.
Yeah. You asked me before about what makes a good product. At the same time, I want something that's fairly consistent. I love my Apple phone, but when they went from the home button to the swipe up, how long did it take? And you know what? That fooled my 4-year-old grandson too. It really threw him for a loop because he was used to pressing the home button on grandma's phone. But so maybe that improved it a little bit. But now they moved the search bar from the top to the bottom. Why? I don't know. Maybe there's something there, but it throws people, millions of users off because they lost their consistency, and suddenly we have to rethink. Now we have to do things with our mind. We have to think, as opposed to just do things unconsciously. So part of that is, I like consistency as well in my products.
I remember Zoom, number one, being adopted at the beginning of the pandemic, and how quickly it was adopted, and what they had to do for the growth, the incredible expansion. And because what they had to do, they had to change the way the software functioned. And all of a sudden they started losing a lot of the users, because a lot of the ease of use had to do with, basically just get a small set of work done. And all of a sudden, your users say, this is great, but if you want something wonderful, I need it to do this, 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 and this. And that is not an easy ongoing discussion to have.
Yeah, that's true. So in terms of this whole discussion that we're having, back to our remote workforce, our virtual teams, back to us as managers, what's the most challenging or possibly the trickiest part? I mean, we've got all these tools. We've got all these great ideas in terms of remote process, but what are some of the trickiest or challenging parts of supporting your team members when you're not working in the office, they're not working in the office, or maybe they're there and you're not, or whatever? But what's the most challenging part of this whole non-touch, non-load of coffee, this kind of world that we're living in right now?
Communications.
Yeah, I think
communications. Right. First of all, when can I communicate? When can I not? It's not intuitive. When I'm just walking down Cubicle Row, I can tell. Second of all, feedback. Feedback, as communications is where I get my feedback. Just interacting and engaging in them in a simple manner is actually giving me hundreds of data points. And how can I actually do that communications in such a way? And like you said, it has to be a conscious activity. It has to be something planned in, or it's not going to happen. How about you?
I very much the same. And I think that last part that you just talked about in terms of being conscious, I buy stamps now in rolls of 100 because an email isn't the same as a handwritten note.
You're exactly right. Thank yous through the mail are a they're a cherished gift. They're not just an interesting thing on my desk for a week.
And it's not just that even in the project sense of what's happening, yes, I can go to the Kanban charts or the burn down charts and I can see the progress. I can see it from a data perspective. Unless I start talking to the individuals, I don't see what's happening in their lives. I don't see what's happening with them. Is that burn down really true? Have I asked the right questions? When I was walking around in the office and they were sitting in the cubicle, I could pop in and they might have said, I'm done, and I can do a couple of questions. And they say, oh, I'm not done. I have to go back and look at something. There are things that I think managers still do, and this remoteness causes them to rely on arts and charts when they should still be relying on that human touch, that pick up the phone, that get on the WebEx, whatever it is, and do the eyeball to eyeball, voice to voice communication to see exactly what's going on with that person.
Yeah. Pablo Casals, he was a famous cellist, and he said, if you want to be a truly great artist, there's spaces between the notes, and you have to learn how to play those spaces between the notes. To be a really great manager and leader, you have to be able to interpret and use those spaces between the communication. And, no communication is still information. And we have to realize that no communication does not mean everything's copacetic.
Yeah. We talked about this earlier, but I keep coming back to it. When I was in the office, and even if I was working on a focused project and had my door closed, my staff could still come in, or my team members could still look through the window, see me sitting there, knock on the window, say, can I come in? I would nod them to come in. They would feel comfortable enough to sit in the chair across from my desk, put their feet up on my desk, and just talk. I can't do that remotely. And that's the part I think that somehow we're missing, and somehow we have to get that part back. I keep harping on that, I know, but it's something that it's the human aspect, it's the people aspects, it's those factors that make projects go around.
So you and I should explore this. What could we add? What are innovations we could add to do this? I have some ideas, and I'd like you to think about that. But before we go there, I think a parallel conversation we can have right now, and it's a good time, is if you have somebody who's just starting down the path of project management, and they're going to be basically working mostly remote, what would you advise them in hitting the ground running, in managing the project, the work, and the people remotely?
Well, some of the things don't change. Get comfortable with the statement of work, get comfortable with that does not change, whether you're in the office or you're working remotely. So that's a given. But besides that, what I would say is get comfortable with the tools you're about to use. The most overused phrase in the English language these last 2 years has been, you're on mute. Nothing is more or nothing is less professional, I think, than not being able to use your tools or having a telephone conversation with your microphone on. So those are little things, but those are the separators between the professional and the amateur. Being able to be comfortable and ease of use with those tools.
You're exactly right. When I started back in 1991, 1992, it was tying your tie in the appropriate manner and having the right pattern on your tie. And now, like you said, the way we can actually express our professionalism is not just how we treat people, but how we use our tools effectively.
And the other way I would say to that young project manager, actually to anybody, not just but certainly to the young project manager, is find your community. If you are working remotely, perhaps you're still in the same city, why not engineer a night out and get together with your team physically once in a while? If you're in different parts of the city, why not arrange for a evening Zoom call or something that fits everyone's time zone? and instruct the people. If you want to have a beer or a glass of wine or a glass of lemonade, bring your favorite bowl of chips, and let's munch and talk. But let's do something that takes us out of the work environment, puts us in a more social space, and let's get to know. I want to know the name of your dog. I want to know what your child did today that was exciting for you, even though you missed it because you were in your office with the door closed. I want to know those things. You want to know those things about me. And so I think that part of just establishing that community is so important for a project manager, and especially a newbie project manager.
Yeah, yeah. And I would add to that, embrace mentoring.
Oh yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, take on 2 or 3 mentees at a time. Okay,
Yeah.
Do that and learn how to support people and learn the give and take of being a mentor. And on top of that, be a mentee too. Find those people who are 3 rungs above you in rank and authority so that you can continue learning and you can still be contributing to the people that report into you. This is, like you said, your community goes up, down, sideways, and build a rich one. And it's wonderful right now. I carry like 3 to 5 mentees on a regular basis. And the conversations are not like what you and I are having. It's like, they got home from work and here's what happened at work, and they're making dinner while we're talking, and I'm making dinner while they're talking, we're talking, and it's a very casual social event, but it still has that structure of problem solving and that critical thinking and the ability to pass on the wisdom and get wisdom from other people.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned before about get comfortable with your tools. I think the other thing is spend the money, or have your corporation spend the money on your behalf for good tools. I don't have the camera that I'm looking through right now to you is not the camera that came with my PC. Those tend to not be as good. This one I paid a couple $100 for so that it gives much more clarity. I can widen it, I can narrow it, I can do what, and it's a much cleaner picture, I think. I put up a couple of soft white lights that are facing me here because I don't have a window facing me. So I want light coming in. So there's nothing more distracting. I was on a Zoom call yesterday with one of my staff who lives in Florida, who positioned himself in front of the window with the light coming in. He was a silhouette. I could not see his face. Every once in a while, when he turned his head, I could see the outline of his glasses. It was the most uncomfortable, unnerving meeting just because I couldn't tell. You're better off to turn your camera off. So I just say, figure out a way to also spend a few $100s and make your environment professional, even as you would in an office.
Yep. And my contribution here would be commit to some type of disciplined self-growth,
Yes.
Personal awareness, right?
Yeah.
Self-actualization, whatever you want to call it, purpose. That's part of it. We live in a unique time right now. We have access to 6,000 years of knowledge, and it's right at our fingertips, and we can pull it in. It's the largest library that our planet's ever seen. And then work on your relationships, your emotional intelligence, understand your emotional mechanism, and then expand that into understanding others.
Hold this up. It's backwards probably in the view, but it's, as you were saying, it's Daniel Goleman's Working with Emotional Intelligence, rereading it. Why? Because you never stop learning. You never, and now you're not commuting half an hour or an hour each way. So spend it doing something that's contributing to your betterment as a person, so you feel better about yourself.
Exactly. And, again, we're climbing up Maslow's hierarchy, whether we like it or not. self-respect and self-actualization used to be unique things that we could not attain. And we're in a rare time in our society where we can actually take every day and at least an hour, spend time on working on ourselves and polishing ourselves and preparing ourselves. And the more we're prepared, the more we can prepare for those who report into us.
Yeah. And the other thing is, for a person who's working at home and feeling like there's less accountability because there are fewer checkpoints in that, this is not a time to hide behind the remoteness. Now is a time to excel, to show your leadership that you appreciate the fact that you can work from home or work remotely, and in doing so, that you can actually accelerate as opposed to stand still or fall behind.
And if this lockdown taught us anything, that hiding behind those the limited check-ins, that leads to a lot of things that irrelevance. First of all, do I really matter? If you do that for 2 or 3 minutes or 2 or 3 months as a worker, I know this because I've seen it in myself and I've seen it in others. All of a sudden, I turned a corner in 1 week, and I've talked to so many people and they did the same thing. All of a sudden, do I matter? Do I really have a reason to work? Do I really have a reason to be here? And that leads you to dark pathways that none of us want to go down.
Yeah. So instead of cheering the fact that your manager's not calling as often anymore, you should be regretting it, because that means they're probably calling someone else and assigning them the best pieces of the work stream. And so, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, boy, we have talked a lot about today. We've gone from tools to working remotely to trading a bunch of stories. And then we kept on coming back to this whole idea at the center of this. It's humans, human progress, human health, and building a healthy relationship. Is there anything else that you can do to cap our conversation, or do you think we've touched on it?
No, I think we've touched on it. We may not have been as organized, perhaps, as we have in the past, but I'm not so sure that we did such a bad job, because we did kind of have the whole conversation flow. And I really value the fact that we were able to exchange ideas. And I'm hoping that especially younger project managers who are breaking into the field at this point can take things that we've talked about today and apply them immediately. Literally, after this podcast, go to their office and apply 1 or 2 concepts that we've talked about today with their own teams, and see if that doesn't already improve their effectiveness on the project.
What cheers me, Merv, is that you come from an area of project management that's totally different from me. And I come from an area that's really strange. And we still have the same focus, the same priorities, and we have the same drive. It really bodes well for anybody listening. This is not the opinion of one person. And again, I can quote many experts and philosophers and all that kind of stuff. But what we're talking about is real, and it's impacting us all.
Well, and that's true. And my goodness, I remember many times having a fresh group of young college kids, I call them kids, but young college professionals come onto my team. And after a while, they become very good at what they're doing in terms of completing their tasks and getting things done. And then they start to kind of, relax a little bit, and we start to maybe lose a little ground. And I have to sit in one thing I keep forgetting, and then I remind myself and bring them back to the fact and say, look, your job here isn't to get the task done on time necessarily, or your job isn't here to collect the paycheck, as good as that is. Your job is, look out there. Look at those people who are struggling with the paperwork and with the mess of their current jobs. What you're doing here is improving their lives. So don't do it for me, don't do it for you, do it for them. And amazingly, when they got that sense of purpose again, that this project wasn't just for the project's sake, but it was to help someone else, amazingly how much better that was. So we have to remind ourselves, we're doing this for someone, not just for the sake of managing projects and process.
Thank you. Thank you for that message. So where can we find you out on the inner tubes?
On the inner tubes, yes, that's
if
good.
If we have any questions.
Certainly LinkedIn, certainly there. Also, I've got some blog posts on my website, peoplefirstprojectmanagement.com. Always willing to answer questions. I play on Facebook. That's kind of my outlet for my humor and that sort of thing. But basically, LinkedIn is where I like to be career focused.
And myself as well. I'm wrapping up a couple special projects, and I'll be out communicating and sharing information again on LinkedIn. I really appreciate the people who connect with me and have questions and comments, but keep them coming. And this is why we do it. It's a journey that we enjoy sharing.
And by the way, it's not like I'm just looking for accolades or questions that I can answer. I'm also looking, if people find something that you or I said that you don't agree with, let's have that conversation. Because although we have lots of experience, we are not the all be all project managers. We have things to learn as well. So
yeah, and shame on any teacher or mentor who cannot learn from their students. They haven't learned the primary lesson.
Well, good. Maybe that should be the topic of another podcast in the future. In the meantime, we'll see you next week, Tim. Same place.
Thanks again, Merv. It's always a pleasure. And thanks, everyone.